Hello, greetings, Struppi, and all. It is November 8th, 2024. We're in Synergetics Livestream 21.1. Previously, Struppi, I looked it up. Synergetics Livestream 16 was on 6/12/2022. So
Wow.
perhaps with only this, welcome back and thanks for joining, and however you'd like to continue, please.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, we've just been talking for a bit already, and you just turned on the light, and I'm just happy to see what more clearly what's set up behind you there. Um, this is the kind of stuff that really tickles my mind, just to see the kinds of structures that people cohabitate with, you know. Maybe that's something we could look into, unless something else comes up. Do you have any particular structures, models that speak to you, that you are, that come to mind when you think about, here's something I want to share. Here's something that I found that I find particularly curious or interesting.
Sure. I will bring up one that is not in the background, but at hand during the day, that is
Better yet.
a personal anecdote and I think connects to a lot of insights you have to share about shape and space and all. And it is this cast dropped bronze, very dense
Study.
and beautiful object that Trevor McCabe created for me in undergraduate when we were roommates in the co-ops. And
Nice.
it's weathered and it's been touched and spun many times. What do you make of this object, and could you maybe contrast and complement with the materials that you're shaping with?
Yeah. Well, I can relate to that being something very nice to have at hand and to play around with. Those things are always good to have. I, I'm basically submerged almost in structures and shapes right now, um, and not not just a few of them are four eyes, but I think none of them are as dense as that one that you have there, I guess. Um, Here's one. So um, this is one frequency because it's only four spheres in the corners, which are the event happenings, where when we're looking closely, we can see the lines coming into critical proximity there before they take a turn and go the other way. And where these lines get into critical proximity, that is indeed an event happening of the sort that constitutes a sphere in synergetics. So this is four of them, and this is a very low frequency because it's just a one frequency. It's along the edge of the shape, there is a single step, a single finger, a single vector, which is the connection between two hearts, two centers of two spheres. And if we contrast that with that one, for instance, that's a nice one. That's a bit more high frequency. This is 4 frequency. And this kind of points towards yours in some ways, because what you have is such a high frequency beyond counting that it's impossible to say what frequency it is precisely. And in my kind of terminology, I would speak of a facet eye for its eyes, because I think in English that what the insects have is called compound eyes. Compound eyes. In German, we speak of Facettenaugen, facet eyes. And I really like the idea of understanding that this single eye, this big eye, the big triangle here, is actually made up of a whole bunch of smaller ones. So it is a compound eye, if you like. And the same is true for your bronze one. It's just the eyes are so minute, so tiny, so small, that it is impossible for us to put a finger through. It's impossible for us to look through. It's impossible for air to get through, for water to get through. And it is not until we get to some sorts of electromagnetic radiation that we get something that is small enough to pass through those openings. But the openings are there nonetheless. And I think that's one of those things that Synergetics gives us a very good embodied experience of, is to realize that something that is supposedly solid and has a, to the naked eye, and a continuous surface, we know, like abstractly, I would say, from science, that there is no continuums there. There is no surface. There is atoms, and the spaces between the atoms are vast and all that. But we don't really, I think, have an actual embodied sense of that most of the time. Whereas with something like this kind of model, one can get a very good sense that, okay, I can feel the big eye, but I can still make out the smaller ones. So it's somewhere at the threshold between the worlds, where it's not as high density, high frequency, small scale, that it is beyond our physical, our corporeal senses. But it already points towards that, and it kind of gives us a bridge to get a sense of that. And I don't know if you recall, Bucky had this beautiful way of describing why we can't put our finger through something like that. And he would say it's like the spinning blades of a propeller, right? If it's spinning at a very low frequency, going around like wom, wom, it's no problem for us to go beep, 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 and put our hand within the circle that is described by that spinning propeller. But there is going to be a threshold where the rounds per minute reach a level where we cannot keep up with, and at that point it becomes effectively impenetrable, because the moment we touch it, it's just going to hurt us very badly. So in a similar way, when we have something like, for instance, your bronze there, which is we could go into the layers of synergetics that lie within the fact that it is what's it called, a legierung,
alloy, amalgamum.
Yeah, thanks, an alloy. And how that relates to synergetics, of course, but just as generally as something where we speak of the density and these aspects of matter, the mass, it's kind of, to me personally, it's a beautiful kind of way of looking at that as with synergetics, we would consider that the individual constituent members of that alloy, of that metal, they are moving, and they are moving at the speed of light, but in such a small volume, such a small domain of space, that it is, especially given the high frequency occurrence of those connected as a constellation of matter, it's impossible for us to comprehend the speed at which the stuff is moving, because it's spinning in such a small area that we couldn't even if it wouldn't move that quickly, we couldn't see it because it's so small. But it is both very small and very fast. And the more stuff we get spinning very quickly in an even tighter volume, the higher the mass, the higher the density. And I think you had a conversation with Noel recently. There was something along those lines where it was about how it was a bit curious to me, because it came from this idea of, here is the numbers and the patterns that come out of that, and this is where electromagnetic radiation, these kinds of things come from. Like, we can make out where it begins. When, from my point of view, looking for a beginning is kind of mute, because it's an eternally regenerative universe. So there is no beginning to be had. It's just that within the realm that numbers give us access to, these patternings of synergetic behaviors and interrelationships, co-arising with that complex, always present set of relationships, are these aspects of our being, like gravity and like magnetics and electric stuff, electricity. These kinds of things are there because we are. It's like co-arising, mutually co-arising, as the Buddhists would say. So yeah, I really like that that thought of, I think he was speaking about the way that an ice figure skater putting in their arms would spin quicker, but then if we had a couple of them, they could get closer as they take in their arms. So that is kind of maybe the connection to what I was speaking of very many things moving at very high velocities and very tight radii, and the higher the more contracted the whole thing happens, the more room there is to pack them more closely, or to draw them in more closely. Just some thoughts.
Yeah. Awesome. I also, of the different thought experiments related to it, exactly like you began with, this is a mnemonic or a symbol of the 4i as a root, or as a node, or itself a nexus or a symbol. And this is a high frequency metal alloy, which brings in all of those ideas about phases of matter. And if this were built with 4 spheres, and that's another way to see it, as being 4 oranges stacked, 3 and 1 out, and then that all material media has a penetrable element, and you can see through the ones at that scale. And that pattern goes all the way down, or small or fast, to the wavelengths of light and radiation, like you brought up, that can move through certain materials. And then you said that the scientific material view, that the space between atoms is large, or that the space of the atom itself is also relatively empty. And yet, what what is the space between, or how do you feel from there? What makes it different than a lecture hall from undergrad chem? How is it different to really feel this beyond just propositionally knowing that, which many may say, yeah. And so then what else or other?
Yeah. I think that Bucky spoke a lot about this chasm that C.P. Snow made out between the natural sciences and the humanities, and he kind of saw synergetics as the bridge that kind of remedies that chasm. And a lot of people, when they speak of what Bucky was doing, they say he made the invisible visible. And I think it's not fair to say it's the invisible, it's the unseen, because we haven't looked. There's nothing invisible about this. Like, we can visualize and model it without any problems, and then it's not just visually comprehensible, but actually whole, with our whole being, with our whole sensorium, we can get a sense of this. And yeah, I think that honestly speaking, I think the biggest oversight that is that the word, that I find with natural sciences in general is that because everything that we've been taught about shape, about connections, about these matters of most intimacy, has been codified and rendered within the language of geometry, which is reasonable because geometry is the study of these things, but it's been codified, it's been conditioned within the metaphysics of a very specific kind of geometry, the Greek Euclidean and all its subsequent offspring. And all of that is inherently unscientific because it's based on axioms that aren't demonstrable. They are just given and then have to be accepted to play the game. And some of the outcomes of this is that, for instance, there is no sense of structure within that geometry because shape is independent of structure. And when I say structure, I mean triangle, because Bucky told us and showed us, more importantly, that those two things are identical. Triangle is structure, structure is triangle. And that is an insight, I believe, that is of the greatest importance to it should be to everyone. And I think it is, even though nobody seems to be aware of it. But to understand that something like the category of polygons, to keep it simple, is actually kind of invalid, or it's misleading because it lumps together the so-called polygon triangle with all the rest of them, the n-gons, without recognizing that one is structure and all the rest is stuff that the triangles do. That kind of makes it very difficult to get a very informed and a very, what's a good word for that? It kind of muddies the water. It makes it very difficult to have a clear understanding of what is going on if these things are just, thrown into the same bucket, into the same box. And from there it keeps going, because the solids, for instance, throw together structurally sound systems with constructs that are only realizable by means of triangulation, which is, irrelevant as long as we keep it in the abstract or draw it out, because nobody cares about the triangulation provided by the paper. But it is my understanding and my deepest sense that we are missing out on even just the smallest things, the most basic aspects of our being, because of these ways in which the realities are obstructed by the narratives and the stories told about them. And effectively, Plato and his pals, his peers, have locked our people, our kin, in the eternal cave, telling them a good story about it, but kind of, making it all into a story, and not really leaving room for the realities that are to be comprehended and understood and embraced and embodied, just out of reach of that entire frame of reference, which are becoming accessible once we entertain and engage with synergetics.
Awesome. I'm gonna throw back some mirrors and see again wherever you want to go. So structure is triangle, triangle is structure. You brought up the omni triangulation.
Yeah.
And that geometry is a cartography of shape, and it lacks structure. Synergetics fuses and blends topology and connectedness with geometry and the mapping, as well as the actual physicalized basis of the sphere packing. And so with that sort of polyvertex idea, instead of the tetrahedra, 4 eyes, being 4 facets or 6 edges, it becomes 4 sphere centers, the kissing spheres, and the sphere packing. And to take it back again to the Greek discussions, like, well, is it water? Is it all water in the smallest? Is it all air? Is it all fire? What are the constituents of matter? And it really is close packed shapes. There are a finite, and that material patterning, which has so many combinations, and it arises in certain structured ways. Carbon with its 4 bonds makes a tetrahedra, face-centered, and all these kinds of crystal geometries relate to the IVM and to the close packing coordinate systems, and at higher and higher frequency, arbitrary shapes can arise because of the solid facet, compounded nature, alloyed nature, high frequency nature. And then conversely, things that are so far apart that you're just a tiny nestmate and it's out of your horizon. It's the other zoomed out And so to connect our sensory apprehension of frequency of the spaces and times we're in to what is also empirically found in sodium chloride and carbon polymers is a really powerful thread that is just dots that are here.
Yeah. And I've been holding on to this here. Speaking of closest drawn spheres, see, personally, I don't like to call them packed, because that comes from the closest packing originates with cannonballs and oranges and all these things, and it kind of presupposes the presence of a large body that keeps everything grounded by gravity. Whereas closest drawn, I think, is more universally applicable, because, I mean, gravity is present everywhere, but even if we had to throw 4 spheres out into the space in between the celestial bodies where no particular one has enough close proximity to influence them, they would draw together until they are closest drawn. And in this case here, I've got a set of 4 vector equilibria, each one created from a whole bunch of beads. But this really neatly kind of shows both the fractality of the IVM, the isotropic vector matrix that you mentioned, which is basically the symmetric, like out of all the crystal packings, all of these systems, this is I would say, the origin, because it is the one where symmetry is omnidirectional and we don't introduce the complexities that we could without any problems of broken, mirrored, whatever kinds of fancy things that are there to be had. No, this is really just following the simple-most pattern of symmetry. Symmetry-wise, it's the simple-most one, where around a single sphere, as we would have in the center here, of each one of these vector equilibria, let me pick that one. This is very similar. This is wooden beads and these are paper straws, but these aren't connected as well. They are just stuck together with these little wooden dowels. And this is the same thing. This is a vector equilibrium, as Bucky called it. It's a dozen spheres around one. If we actually looked at the spheres at play, and I mean, I don't have to tell you, but perhaps someone is watching who hasn't yet understood what we're speaking of. So if we're looking at something like this, what we speak of as the spheres is the vertices of these systems. So everywhere where the vectors, which I call fingers, these straws, where they meet, that's the center of a sphere. And I could show, most certainly, if I dig for it long enough, because it's all buried in spheres, I could show a version. Let's pick this one, for instance. This is the same basic organism, the same basic structure. In this case, it's a fractal of the vector equilibrium where every sphere of this one, every vertex of this one, is now embodied by an 8-eyes. The old Greeks would call the octahedron. So this is 3 on the top and 3 on the bottom, and then there's in the center 6 around 1. So altogether that's a dozen around 1. And that is the the closest drawn spheres pattern that happens around a single sphere, right? So every single sphere already embodies this within it. And the moment that we put similarly sized spheres around that one as a nucleus, we do eventually get to this pattern of a dozen around one. So that is a very, very, very central shape and structure within synergetics. It's the one that Bucky had a couple of names for over time. He settled eventually on the vector equilibrium, which is a very good name because it speaks of both the presence of the vectors here, the lines of force, the lines of relationships between the spheres, but it also emphasizes the balance that is happening here, and the equilibrium there is it's not a static balance because there's no such thing. It's a very dynamic balance. As we can see, this actually dances, right? There is these quadrilateral openings, and they allow for the triangles in this context to dance in relationship to one another. So this is another name for it in Bucky's terminology. Early on was the dimexion. He actually called this the dimexion, which subsequently was the name he gave to his early inventions, the car and the house and the map, most importantly. But another name at the time was 4D because it's four-dimensional. We could look at this, and maybe I'll take this one. Here, because in this I've color-coded the vectors a little, so it kind of shows more clearly that we can perceive of this as a complex of 4 hexagons that are interrelated in this way, folded into one another. There's various ways we could fold them, but this is one where we see that it's basically 4 planes. There's the red one here, there's a white one, black one, and a green one. And these 4 planes are the 4 planes of space-time. And that's something Bucky wouldn't have said necessarily, but I would emphasize that, and I would dare to state that as a matter of fact. These are the 4 planes of space-time. And it's the exact same 4 planes that manifest in the 4 eyes, just as in your bronze one. So whenever we get 4 spheres that we closest draw, so to speak, as in these here, we could think of one sitting on 3, but they create 4 planes between them, among them, because every triangle defines a plane, and this is 4 triangles, and this is the same exact 4 planes that manifest within the vector equilibrium, but in this case they manifest in terms of hexagons. Yeah, and there's a whole lot we could talk about with these. So much, we could take it to a very comprehensive deconstruction of the categories of solids and all that stuff. Anyways, we could go anywhere, really, because this is a good place to begin with and to go from. It's a good place to center in, and it's also arguably the geometry of 0, which is a very curious kind of thing, because generally speaking, people don't think of 0 as a shape. They think of it as nothing. But it is a shape. It has a shape, and it's the place where all of these planes that like, how do I say this? If we pick one of these planes, let's say the white one here, as our plane of reference, then, or let's pick the red one because it's level with the ground, and since we kind of share the ground, it's a good basis for reference. So if the red one here is level with the ground, then we have one little 4 eyes on the top here that is pointing at the ground and opening its eye to the sky. And with Kirby, I've been calling this a sky pod, whereas the other one on the bottom here points at the sky and looks at the ground, and we could call that a tripod. So we have a tripod and a sky pod here. And both of them could be grown out, right? We could keep on expanding this. Indeed, I do have, for instance, a 2-frequency vector equilibrium here, which is already a whole lot more complex. And that kind of, it's both obscuring the thing that I want to emphasize right now, but it's also, for those who know, it shows it. Hold on, I'm going to pick up another one that is a little less complex and shows it more clearly. Let's pick this one. Why not? Okay, so here is a variant of the 2-frequency vector equilibrium. And in this case, just to compare it to the one I showed before, the difference between these two is with regards to omnitriangulation. We mentioned that word, because in this one here, we actually have all the spheres present of the second layer of spheres around that nucleus, which shows up in, all of these. It's actually 3.5 dozen, so 42 spheres in the second layer. And there is a sphere at this place, like this is a vertex here, which is sitting in the middle of this face. If we apply the old language, we would call this a face, the square face. And in the center of that is a sphere. And I left that out on this one. So this is the same structure except for those vertices in the center of those openings. And because it's not there, this actually moves again, right? Still, even though this is a more complex, higher frequency variation, which we could take up further, but I'm going to spare you that because I would need to first. Oh, it's there. Okay, I can show you if you like. But what this kind of shows still is that we have these planes, these hexagonal planes, just as before, right? So this is, we had it this way around, and that be the same orientation. And this is actually still at the heart of this. You can see it there. That's the nucleus. Here, same thing. But in this case, we see more clearly how from that level ground we were beginning with, that hexagon, we have that 4 eyes up here, our sky pod and our tripod on the bottom, which expand further. And we could, again, keep on growing that. We could increase the frequency of that further and further, however far we wanted. The thing is, it would keep on growing in both directions. Or in other words, if we took this, Bucky was explaining this with 4 eyes made of cheese, because you could just cut off slices of the cheese, right? So if we were to think of this, we could cut in this plane, or in that plane, or in that plane, and the remainder would still be a 4 eyes. Or if we keep growing, we add another layer, it still remains a 4 eyes. all in all. So whether we move out this one plane in this direction or we turn it around and do it in this direction, doesn't really matter. It doesn't change anything about the qualities of the four eyes as such. And the moment that we would move this one plane, not this way where it keeps growing in volume, but that way, there would be a moment eventually where, let's pick this one, where we would reach the place where it turns the other way around, inside out, right? That point, after that point, if we keep moving our plane, again, it keeps growing in terms of volume, right? So this way it grows, this way it shrinks until we get to that point where it begins to grow again, but in the other direction. But something very special happens at that point, right? Because at that place, the volume of that particular four eyes, this pair of four eyes that we're considering right now, in that very place, it would be zero if we moved all our four planes, or really just one of the four planes, into that opposite corner, vertex. We would have all four planes coinciding in the same point, in the same sphere. And then we would have the four planes meeting up just as they do in the vector equilibrium. Right, so in that regard, the vector equilibrium, even though it itself has a volume, and could, there's many ways to look at that, could be a volume of 8, could be a volume of 1,008, which is 20. Arguments could be had for both, but it's also in some way the volume, the shape of a zero volume four eyes. Because just as I was saying before, if we keep shifting our plane into that nucleus, into that one point of origin where they all meet, then in some way that four eyes that could grow into any direction is now at zero volume. And that is a curious kind of quality if we think of the weird ways in which, and I'm no expert on that at all in terms of mathematics, I just know that, for instance, dividing something by zero is kind of weird what happens, and there is ways in which some mathematical operations get towards zero and they diminish all the way, and then at zero they kind of get into this limit case. But if we keep going, they go in the other direction. So what happens there is the exact same thing that happens here. We have our mathematical operation being the four eyes that is expansive in this direction and then diminishes towards that nucleus. And in the nucleus itself, we reach that plane where really what happens is that the one volume on the one side, let's call it the positive volume, is all the way opened up into a hex, which is a neutral kind of situation, before after that point it folds back into itself and creates a volume of a negative kind, the inverse of the former. And in that way, this is the geometry of zero. And if we think about the relevancy of zero, and Bucky made it a big important point in his Synergetics to speak about the moment that zero, the cipher, was introduced into Western mathematics and how absolutely groundbreaking and absolutely, tectonic kind of shifts happened after that point. Now, just just imagine what could happen to our current state of science if they were to understand that actually zero, even in a very real way, zero is a shape, has a shape. What does that open, right? What kinds of comprehension are to be found beyond that point?
Thank you, Struppi. A few threads I wrote down. I really appreciated that move through. So, I saw a new cycle. We have the 12 around 1 nucleus of the vector equilibrium, which is the intersection, the 0-point intersection of the 4 hexes, which are 6 around 1, which make up the 4 omnisymmetrical planes of the 4 eyes with the tet. The tet, or 4 eyes, is the 4 close-drawn spheres, the centers of which are the ones, the 4 1 vectors, unit length vectors in the quadray coordinates. And the 0 is the 0 origin of the quadray coordinates. And so what is it that blows up to infinity as the plane goes to 0? The surface area to volume. So as you move, for example, through 1 quadray or time, as XYZ moves through time, like being scanned through time or seen through time, in time, then you have the sphere being removed, layers, high frequency, going down to low frequency, 4, 3, 2, 1 sphere, 1 spinning vector equilibrium, 0, negative, and then growing out the other side. And it brings it all into vector equilibrium, hexagonal planes. That's the tet planes. Those are the spheres, but spheres are just higher frequency VEs. And so that's how the scales connect. 4 packed VEs make a tet. 4 drawn VEs make a 4 eyes.
Yeah. And 6 make an 8 eyes, like this. Right? Yeah, I really like that, the way that you put that together. And you know, you spoke of the frequencies there, right? You said 4, 3, 2, 1. So can you tell me what a 0 frequency tet would look like?
What is the sound of a 0 frequency 4 eyes clapping?
Very lonesome.
This relates to before we began and talking about the number tables that Noel showed, and about how different ways to see these number sequences, and about putting on my computer science hat and seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, ... and write a program. What's the pattern? Abstract it. And that sees the finite, the minute particulars, as instances, species, to be generalized over, by seeing abstraction as a teleos of inquiry. And then you were talking about thinking with the beads and not being able to think more than the beads, and about the material finiteness of our tools and our niche as extended cognition, and about being with the finiteness of the tools in our surroundings and inquiring with them, not seeing them as examples to be just generalized and abstracted away from.
Yeah. It's actually, I mean, I don't know if you actually answered my question, but we'll hold on to that. But the other day, I think yesterday, I was catching up on the recordings of Steve Thomas's channel on where they are reading as a little book club as well. They're reading a fuller explanation, and they are going through that very slowly in their own time. And they just read that section about the finite coordinate system versus an infinite one. So maybe it's relevant to first kind of make clear what an infinite coordinate system would be. That would be the Cartesian one, for instance, where it is presumed that any point in that system is infinitely small, i.e. nobody. Every line in that system, like the axes of that system, go on straight to infinity. Planes are laid out to be infinite, and so forth. So that's an infinite system. And it's no problem within that realm to consider, for instance, something like the time, the number line going from a 0 point to positive infinity and negative infinity, right? It's no problem to abstractly conjure up that thought where Bucky would go like, okay, so if that line continues out infinitely, it would go out the window and then over the hill and behind the horizon, and eventually it would come back into the door on the other side because it so went around the world, right? It would back up, it would reach back into itself in such a way. So that is the one that we're familiar with, is the infinite one. But what is a finite coordinate system? Well, that is one where potentially it could go until as far as we need it, right? So, for instance, some of the largest embodiments of that finite coordinate system from our point of view would be the kinds of galaxies that are beginning to be visualized by something like the JWST, right? These super far distant galaxies, or if we want to not take a whole galaxy, but just a star, let's take the one star that is the furthest away from us that we can make out with our telescopes, a single star. Now that star, whether or not it's still present in the place where we see it, that's a different kind of question. But the light of that star, from the moment when it ignited, was expanding outwards omnidirectionally in a sphere from that star as the point of origin. And in the time that it took to travel all the way to us, if we consider that the radius of that sphere of light, it's a very, 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 very big sphere, right? And now a sphere, if we looked at it in terms of the Greek idea of a sphere, it's this all these infinite abstractions again, where we have a surface of infinite points, and around every single one of those points there is an infinitesimally small 360 degrees or whatever, these ideas. So it's a continuous shell of a sphere, and that is not something that we can actually find in reality. So arguably it's not really useful as a definition of a sphere or a model of a sphere. Whereas if we took it with synergetics, where a sphere is a finite, a definite number of vertices on a membrane, all approximately of the same distance of an approximate center, that gives a lot more room for the kinds of variations that we actually find in reality. And once we get into that, then we realize that the vector equilibrium actually gives us a very good model to coordinate a single sphere, or indeed a whole lot of spheres. And if we thought of that that same kind of model I was showing here, these two, let's take these two. Now, if this was our star, let's say a light year after it started igniting, so the radius length of this vector equilibrium is 1 light year, then this one, or indeed this one, would be the same star at 2 years, 2 light years out, right? So we can see how the complexity of the system increases, and as it expands, let's pick up this one. This is kind of a variation on the same structure where I reduced the 3 frequency to the minimum set of connections that allows me to do this dance. So that would be our star at 3 light years out from the center. And now we could take this out to all the way, whatever distance, couple of billion light years we would be looking at it from. And still, there is a definite number of light years, right? It's not infinitely far away. It's finitely far away. And just as that is a definite, a definite number of light years in distance, so that is also a definite radius of that emanating sphere, which isn't to say that it goes past us. Of course it does. It's been going past us for a long while, and it's been expanding beyond us. We've been casting a shadow in it as our planet has traversed. It's been casting a tiny little speck of a shadow in that ever-expanding sphere, which is probably drawing some kind of spiral line. Like if we took our star, the sun, where we're actually going around it, if we consider how that sphere of light keeps expanding, we can see how our presence as Earth is casting a little groove of shadow in that expanding sphere, right? It's like a groove on a record. It's a record of us, of our being present. And if we do happen to have an observer somewhere out, further removed, who had the same light growing out towards them, and they happened to coincide with that record of that shadow, that spiral of shadow that we were casting, they would, for a second, have that little shadow cast on the light of the sun. That's the way that we are able to study planets in extrasolar systems, right? And other star systems. We're watching for those minute shadows. But it's not really that in that moment, in that instant where we see the shadow pass by, the star that we're looking at is long gone from that place. The planet may have been swallowed up or disappeared altogether, but it's the record of that light sphere emanating out from that star that is just now coming past us, passing us by. Just now in our presence, because this is in other words, it's to say the star has traversed from its point of origin all the way towards us. Whether or not it's still there is a different question. It's come here now. And we're sitting on that shell of that vast sphere of light, or in other words, electromagnetic radiation. It's not just light. And we just so happen to come across that groove of where that little planet moved between us and its star, right? So why am I going on with all of this? One observation out of all of that is that the so-called vacuum of space is not empty, because it is clearly full of all of that radiation. But also, to bring it back to this notion of the dimexion that I spoke of earlier, I think what perhaps sets Bucky apart from many of his contemporaries, besides many other things, is that when he spoke of radio, I think he wasn't actually concerned only with the radii bit, but also with the circumferential, because to his mind it was clear that when there is a radius of that radio wave emanating out from its point of origin, there is also with that radius a circumferentius, right? There's a whole sphere present. So, this, to bring it back to that, this is a way where we have we get a universally applicable coordinate system that we can tune into whatever kind of system we're zeroing in on. We can tune it to the kind of frequency that we're looking at. For instance, in that sphere of light I was talking about, because it's the light of a star, there's a whole spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, which isn't digital, right? It's not a discrete set of frequencies, but it's an analog spectrum, right? So whatever that does to our visualization of that vector equilibrium, if we consider that it is actually a whole spectrum of frequencies, right? It's not just like this would be perhaps the frequency of, let's say, blue light or so, but it is coexisting with all the other frequencies of all the other lights, right? So all of those are, sometimes they are interfering with one another positively, negatively, or not at all. Sometimes they just, cohabitate, coexist, but they are always present. And the irony is that we are looking out at the stars, and the only time we see the stars is when we're looking at the point of origin. So our line of sight follows the radius. But we tend to omit and forget about the entire circumferential of that system, right? We're not considering that the same star that we're looking at is casting a sphere of light, because you could see it from where you're sitting and I could see it from where I am sitting at the same time, possibly. Like, I think we're not too far removed in terms of our kinship Earth, so that, for instance, our own sun, we can see at the same time. So, we're both looking at this sphere of light in our individual radii from our perspectives. But the point I'm trying to make is that even the furthest removed of these stars that have been shining out for the longest time, it's not infinitely big. It's got a finite lifespan. It's got a finite period. Like, actually, that shell of light, from the moment it begins shining, it goes out, and for the longest time it's going to be like this. It's going to be a completely filled in structure of electromagnetic radiation. But eventually the point of origin is burned out, right? The star stops shining, it turns supernova or whatever, probably still does something. But at that point, we still have that shell keeping on growing out, right? While the inside of that shell is now empty, so to speak, right? And I really kind of like that way of looking out into the stars and also realizing it's the same thing with you and I, because the reason I can see you now is because there's a camera in front of you that is having its own perspective, its own point of view onto the sphere of light that emanates from you. But at the same time, that mug behind you, even though you can't see it, sees you insofar as it casts a shadow in your sphere of light, right? And so if our sphere of light is uninterrupted, if there is nobody there to see it, to cast a shadow in it, that sphere of light equally keeps emanating outwards. And that is a profound kind of thought, right?
It's always eclipsing somewhere when.
Yeah.
Let me ask another question as we converge towards the end of this chapter. 2024 is the sum of the first 22 layers of the Tet Four Eyes compound. 22 frequency.
I think it's 21 frequency. It's 22 layers, is 21 frequency.
Okay. Thanks. As we accrete in even that one numbering system, another VE, how do we take these feelings and understandings and ways into the next minute, into the next day, into 2025?
Well, I cannot speak for you, nor for anyone else, but I can tell you that for the last 6 years of my life that I've been learning about this stuff, this has changed every aspect of my life very profoundly. And I do understand that it can be difficult to relate this stuff to other people because they may not see the relevancy to their lives. And something that I get often as response, particularly from well-educated people, where it's even more tragic. Like when I share this with a mathematician, and I'm like, my mind thinks, oh, if only they knew, what would they come up with? You know, that's kind of my impetus of sharing. And what I get in return is that kind of, nah, so what? Yeah, one could do it that way. Or very often I hear that, why should I bother? You know, we have this and it works. And I'm like, where does it work exactly? Do you not see climate change? Do you not see all these problems? Do you not see how they relate to this? Because to me, it's very clear. Yeah, but I think kind of a part of me wants to answer that question with a demonstration of the behaviors of these models, because that is the thing that is exceptional about synergetics, the demonstrability. Because, for instance, if we compare our model that we've been brought up with, which is the Cartesian one, in its realized version here with our concept of it, we'll find that the concept has no problem in separating out space and time. And space is supposedly three-dimensional, time is a line, whatever. And space is supposedly static. Now, why? Why would it be static? Well, because if it wasn't, if it is actually allowed to be dynamic, we figure out that this model doesn't hold. Like, shouldn't the very basic model of what we call space, shouldn't the very unit of volume that we've chosen above any other, shouldn't that at least be able to hold shape? Shouldn't it be able to hold a volume? Like, I'm asking you, shouldn't that be the minimum kind of quality of something that we chose for such a central and fundamental tool in our relating to universe?
Reminds me of chip off the old block, and if we shave planes off the four eyes, we keep the four eyes and we tap into that cycle. But if we take planes off of a cube, it's not a cube anymore. There's actually no natural way, and the staticness and the separation of space-time, and space-time's agentically constructed. Whether we see space and time in one way or another is a cognitive, cultural thing, not some kind of externally stable reality that a given mind comprehends, as evidenced by the variety of perspectives and change in them through time.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's kind of, we're so used to all of these geometries and all of the things that come out of those to be abstract, which is why I keep saying that there is a fundamental axiom that is unstated, which is that geometry could be abstract or should be. You know, that I think Synergetics provides ample evidence to the contrary. But it is one kind of thing that everyone accepts, you know, because we've never been shown otherwise. We've never been brought to the awareness that this could be the case. Like, most people have never noticed that a cube as such can't hold its shape. Now, this, what it does do is shapeshift very well. For instance, like, here's our hex. We spoke of that earlier. Now, if I fold that, here is a single eye. That's sweet. Here is a four eyes. And as space-time does, here's the inverse, the inside out. Sweet. What else? Here is two of them. Bucky's bow tie. Or here is the six eyes. Also nice. Right? So there's lots of things that this can do while it cannot hold the cube shape. What do we have to do to manifest, to realize the cube? Well, right now this is a non-struct. And many people who I share this with, they go like, oh yeah, we just need to, you know, put something in the corners, stiffen the corners. And I say, yeah, sure, we do that. What we do there is we put in micro-triangulation. For instance, if glue or a weld in the terms of a steel cube, for instance, those are cases where if we took our microscope and tuned into that thing that we put there, we find, oh, there's triangulation between the molecules, and that can hold the cube, just so. But if we keep it in the same reality, in the same materiality as we have here, which is in this case paper straws with a piece of cotton string running through them, some wooden dowels just to make sure that the straws don't bend, and I also put some tape on the ends so that the straws don't rip open. But basically we could do the same thing just with the paper, straws, and string. Now if I take the same exact stuff, namely paper, straws, and string, and yes, this one also has the dowels in it and the tape on the ends, and actually, as a matter of fact, there's 2 wooden beads here, but they will come into play in a second. If I have this, this is a set of 3 straws, you see? And when I look at a pair of them like this, what I have here, this is like a pair of levers, whatever your language says. And if we do have that pair of levers, we have the fulcrum here in the corner, in the vertex, where these are moving freely around. Like I can, this thing can go any which direction. And I'm going to pick this one because there's no line there, but pointing out. Okay, so we are familiar with leverage, right? As a basic principle of physics. If I want to keep this angle defined in one way, it's very hard to do that in the fulcrum. It's very, very difficult. Whereas if I move to the end of the levers, I get leverage, meaning it's the easiest thing in the world to define that angle on this end of the levers. Now what happens if we add another member here at the end of the levers and we triangulate? Well, now all of a sudden this additional member stabilizes the ends of the levers, and by stabilizing those, it defines the angle in the opposite corner. And we find that this is true around the whole thing. So every corner is stabilized by the opposite member. And what I want to point out here, I said earlier, structure is triangle, triangle is structure. This is structure. And it's the only self-regenerative structure that there is, period. Triangulation is what gives rise to structure. And this is like, this should be so clear to everyone that it shouldn't even be necessary to say. But I am afraid that most people aren't aware of this, because to them, triangle is a polygon. It's just one shape among the many. And yes, they tend to say that triangles are the strongest shape. The strongest, which kind of suggests that there is another kind of shape that is less strong, but still a shape. And that kind of points at the fact that people do not understand the triangle structure. Because if we have any shape at all, there has got to be triangulation at some level of the system at play. Okay. Now, this system here, this triangulation, this beautiful kind of structure creates an eye, because if we do have 3 spheres, as we do here, 1, 2, 3, there's going to be a gap between them where we can look through, and I do call that eye. This is also defining a plane. If you ever put down a tripod, you notice that where a 4-legged stool or a table or whatever will rock unless both the legs are ideal and the floor is very, very level, the 4-legged will rock. No tripod will ever rock. It can tip over, but it cannot rock. Why is that? Because the 3 legs define a plane wherever we put them down, right? And the reason why it could tip over is if the center of gravity of the tripod moves out over the triangle on the ground, then it tips over. It's not rocking, okay? So this is not rocking science. But what I'm trying to point out here is the matter of fact that triangulation is the same basic principle as leverage, right? I don't know if that is clear to everyone, but we cannot separate the two. Basically, triangulation is the continuation of leverage, right? It's the same exact principle played out further. And that is something that we find in synergetics generally. We're operating on the basis of generalizable principles, and we can keep on expanding them. We can keep them unfolding, right? Is that good? You look as if you're thinking something. Don't you dare!
It's both a lot to process and simple, and questions how we process to really absorb this insight and how to pull with enough distance on our own built environment, education, operating systems, how to see through the boxes that everywhere we follow our curiosity and integrity compass, we return to these attractor concepts that are not in a skyscraper gravity bound hierarchy, but much more like a multi-perspective tangle and play happening, as you pointed out, with the close drawn, when we really remove the need for scale-specific gravity, and we want to be talking about something that could work underwater, on land, in the space among the stars, we substitute the higher, lower, flat Earth gravity centrism with its false applicability across scales where gravity doesn't matter in a gas or in a metal at that scale, and use something that is related to the operations of the constraints and possibilities of the real bodies and forms as they interact.
And I mean, you're almost enticing me to go on into speaking about gravity, and that's a whole big rabbit hole of its own. But you're kind of also, you bring it back to the box, and this is where we're going with this. And I still want to take us there, because I'm just, the reason I'm demonstrating this is both for the reason that it is demonstrable, right? We're doing science here. I'm experimentally verifying something that I'm really inviting everybody who perchance watches this. Go ahead, do it for yourself. Figure it out for yourself, because it's one thing to watch this on a screen. It's a whole different beast to actually do it with your own hands and feel it, dance with the thing. And I do have a video on my channel where I'm actually creating this very model, because I think that was in response to the session of you and the others doing the Zoom model, because I felt like this is perhaps the most central and fundamental synergetic model that I would like to share with everybody in the world. Like, we should be clear about this. This should be, our the page that we all come to meet at, or whatever we use as a metaphor. This should be common sense. Let's put it that way, right? And yes, it is both a lot to wrap your mind around, because I keep adding layers of information that aren't necessarily the most irrelevant to where we are right now and where we're going. But I do think they are so relevant in general that it's worthwhile to bring them in. But when I'm sharing these things, I'm sharing what I call the stories of the spheres. This synergetics is the way of the spheres, like the way as in the Tao. And this is a set of stories that the spheres themselves tell us if we listen. And I'm just choosing my words to go along with that so that it's easier to comprehend. But this is stuff that the spheres themselves do. That is so. And when we're listening to these stories, it's not like we're in school and we have to have a test in the end and every single detail needs to be remembered. No, this is just stuff that I share, and those listening, everyone will take away something, and the chances are that this something is like a kernel, like the seed crystal of a snowflake that can grow out, which becomes their own embodied understanding of synergetics. And I keep, when I share these things, as much as I share, I could go on for days on this, just with what is around me here. But in the end, I'm going to tell you this is just the snowflake on the tip of the iceberg. Right? So keep that in mind. We're at the seed crystal of that snowflake right now. There's a whole glacier. There's a whole ice cap.
Great.
Okay.
Do you have any last comments or anything you want to close out with?
Yeah, let me just complete this storyline, because it would be missing out on something very important if I didn't. So let us look at two of these, right? I've shown you one. Here's a second. Both are the same, except for the color. Now, if we go to school, they tell us 1 + 1 is 2. And we all accept that as a matter of fact. Let's challenge that and see if it proves, if it adds up. So I'm going to integrate these two triangles. What I'm doing here is I do say, I call the triangle an eye, because it's the opening between three spheres where we can look through. I call the centers of gravities of those spheres, I speak of hearts in that case. It's a bit of a poetic choice. And I call these vectors, these lines of relationship, I call them fingers. And every finger points two ways. Keep that in mind when the Zen koan says, Zen is just the finger pointing at the moon. The finger is pointing two ways. Yeah, so what I have here with these beads that I mentioned before, I call those fingertips. Okay. And what we do now is we take the fingertip and we put it into the corner of an eye. Okay. If that isn't relatable, I don't know what is. And between the two passes of that string that runs between these straws, because really it's a loop that goes between those two beads and passes through the three straws. So in these corners of the eyes here, there's actually two lines running past. And I can place my fingertip between those two. And by doing so, I've integrated them. I've added this. And I go on, take another fingertip and put it in the next corner of the eyes. And we have an eye. An eye for an eye. Lets the world see something new, I hope. Next one, next fingertip, next corner. And with that, we have a pair of eyes. So 1 + 1 is 2, right? Here's the 2. And they are like a bird, like a hinge that can dynamically shapeshift still. And we still have a remaining finger, a remainder. And when we put that in place into the last corner of the eyes, what we get out of the operation is, in fact, 1 + 1 is 4 eyes. Now that is nothing new to the synergeticists in the house. The synergetics may still be of interest. I think it should be something, again, common sense and so forth. And now that I have this, we return to our friend the cubic non-struct here, and we can put our 4 eyes into that cubic frame, like so. Can embrace that. And the first thing that is noteworthy here is that now this cubic frame allows us to hold on to the center of gravity of our 4 eyes. And you mentioned the quad rays. To those engaged with that, this is also the quad rays here. But besides that, our cube can now hold on to, with the lines that run through its corners, can hold on to those fingertips. And if I go around one by one, all of a sudden this whole thing starts to take shape. And to the last one, it's still floppy and dynamic, but once that last one is connected up, we get a cube, as they call it. Now we have a construct. We have added the struct into the con. Well, it's construct because it's with structure, right? And the reason why this is now stable and holds its shape is that the addition of the 4 eyes in there actually triangulates the entire thing. So everything about this is now triangles, and therefore it is structurally sound. It is stable, right? And this is where I want to leave us, where you asked me about this year and next year, and I really just, if I could wish for one thing in the world, with all the chaos and all the nonsense that is going on everywhere at once, I would wish us as a species, as all our human kin, to, for whatever reason, become aware of this reality. Because it allows us to, for once, step out of the framing where the best we can do is to think outside the box, where we still take the box for granted and keep it there. Because for once we can say, look, rather than calling this normal and this abnormal, or square and square root, let's focus in on that relationship here. Let's focus in on the many eyes that give rise to all kinds of beautiful life forms. And for once, practice being without the box. Because we don't need it. We don't. We can do without. And actually, we can do better without. Once we actually become aware of all those synergetic principles, all these shapes, all of the stuff, all of the vast depth of this ocean of spheres, there is no actual need to keep on boxing, because that is perhaps the most nonsensical abstraction of all. And it's perhaps the only alien in the universe, is the idea of the static solid cube, which defines our confines of space. And once we get past that, we can begin to actually grow into integrity with kinship earth, with our more than human kin, with our, with our every fiber of being, and mend the web of life that we've been devastating for so long, destructing, right? We've been ignorant of the structures and therefore destructing. We've been a destructive force when we are really shape-shifting apes, that, shaping apes. We could do so many immensely wonderful things that are far beyond what the current conditioning allows us to conceive of. And it's lots and lots of fun, and so much more the more people join in, because the more the merrier. And there's so much ground to cover, so much ground to recover, and it's enough for everyone to go around.
Thank you. I'm very appreciative we could speak, Struppi. I'm honored that you can complement and balance other synergetics, bodies of work, and ways of thinking and speaking. And I resonate with your encouragement for the year to come.
Yeah. Likewise.
Okay. Till the next
Maybe
one.
not in a year.
We'll talk sooner. Thank you, Struppi.
Awesome.
Bye.
Take care.